right, let's go ahead and get started. I know a lot of people are still signing on, but we're just going to go over some housekeeping stuff for this first minute or two. So thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar. This is the PFAS Challenge, Ensuring Compliance in Electronics Manufacturing. My name is Amy Groughton. I'm the Senior Manager of Marketing and Operations for GreenSoft Technology. And your host today is Randy Flinders. Randy is the Compliance Specialist for GreenSoft Technology. And Randy is our in-house expert for compliance and environmental regulations. He's been in the industry for 30 years, and you guys are going to get a chance to ask him your questions during our Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Before I hand it over to Randy, just to let you know, we are recording this webinar, and yes, everyone here will receive a copy of the recording after we complete the webinar, as well as a PDF copy of the slides. And so as you think of any Q&A questions throughout the webinar, you can go ahead and type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel, and we'll save them all till the end, and I'll read them off to Randy at the end of the hour, or towards the end of the hour. So all right, let's go ahead and get started. Over to you, Randy.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks everybody for joining today. As Amy mentioned, today we're going to be discussing PFAS, specifically PFAS challenges facing electronic manufacturers and how we can address those challenges. Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about an overview of PFAS. What is PFAS, what it's about, and when someone's talking about, hey, we have PFAS restrictions, what exactly do they mean? We're going to review the status of different PFAS requirements in the European Union as they relate to electronics manufacturers, and then move right into the requirements in the United States. And then after that, we'll talk about GreenSoft's PFAS solution and how GreenSoft can assist in meeting your requirements. All right, so I have a lot to cover on this webinar today. So let's go ahead and get started with the PFAS overview. So what is PFAS? Well, PFAS is not one specific chemical. It's not one specific mixture, but rather it's a generic class of chemicals. And when you look at different requirements that are facing electronics manufacturers, there is no one global definition of what PFAS is. So as you can see here, OECD has their own specific structural definition of PFAS. But when we compare that to the definition referenced by Maine and Minnesota, you could see that one's a lot more generic. Moving on to the EU proposed PFAS ban, you see yet another structural definition of what constitutes PFAS. And then looking at, say, EPA TSCA Section 8A7, you have yet another structural definition of what's in scope for PFAS under that reporting requirement. So you can see there's a lot of variance in exactly what, from a technical perspective, is considered PFAS when we're looking at these regulations. Now, PFAS is referred to as forever chemicals, and you may have heard that term in the media because they break down very slowly and they accumulate in the environment and in human tissue. And it's been found in the liver, it's been found in newborn babies. So there is a concern of the long-term impact of these chemicals, both in the environment and to human health and safety. Because PFAS is really a category of man-made compounds, there is no master list of PFAS that we can refer to. So if someone says, hey, do you have PFAS present? You can't just simply pull up one list and compare to that list and say yes or no specifically. If we look at OECD, they have a list where they've identified over 5,700 chemicals on their PFAS list, while EPA's master inventory has over 15,000 chemicals classified as PFAS. While 12,697 as of March of those meet the definition of PFAS reportable under Section 8A7. And keep in mind that no matter what list you're working with, it's not an exhaustive list. It's a reference list. So when you have some PFAS that you know is present that's not present on one of these lists, it's quite possibly still in scope for reporting and restriction. The lists that are out there are just for reference. Now, PFAS is a relatively new requirement facing industry. There's a lot of research ongoing right now globally. We have EPA, individual US states, European Chemicals Agency, OECD. They're, of course, doing a bunch of research trying to evaluate PFAS and figure out how to restrict and regulate it. But we also have other entities working on this, different research bodies are working on this, industry associations, all trying to quantify and qualify the risks associated with PFAS so that the world can address this in an intelligent way. However, they're taking varying approaches in doing so. We have the approach of analyzing and restricting on a single substance basis. An example of that is PFOS, which is restricted under persistent organic pollutants regulation as well as other regulations. Then you have other bodies that are looking at this problem in the context of groups of PFAS. For example, polymeric versus non-polymeric PFAS, the idea being that maybe non-polymeric PFAS is presents a lot more risk than non-polymeric. And then you have yet other organizations who are just looking at PFAS as risk overall, and they're addressing it as a problem where we have to restrict all PFAS and just allow essential uses, perhaps, rather than try and do whack-a-mole and hit one at a time, or whether trying to break it up into different groups. They're looking at, let's just get rid of PFAS completely, and then maybe we'll need to allow it on an exception basis or a case-by-case basis. So these varying approaches are making it very difficult for the industry to put together a process to meet the different varying requirements. So then looking at, well, what kind of PFAS restrictions are facing electrical and electronic equipment manufacturers today? When we look at that, we find there is no specific regulation or directive in force which generically restricts PFAS as a substance group. So in other words, there is nothing the electronics industry facing that says I can't use PFAS generically. There are current restrictions on a substance by substance basis. There different legislation requires that specific PFAS be prohibited or reportable or restricted, such as EU REACH and persistent organic pollutants, etc. But there is no one mandate to eliminate PFAS from our products in force at this time. Most of the legislative activity facing electronic equipment manufacturers is on an individual substance basis. Now, there is a lot of legislative activity happening, however. There is a focus on drinking water and a focus on firefighting foams. And there are also restrictions emerging on non-electronic products like children's toys, food contact products, textiles, rugs, carpets, cosmetics, etc. However, there is a proposal in the EU to restrict all PFAS in all products, and Maine and Minnesota have enacted similar reporting requirements and ultimate restrictions as well. And we're going to get into those eventually because those include electronic equipment. So now that we've summarized what PFAS really is, let's take a look at what the status is of different requirements in the EU. What are we facing today and what are we facing in the future? Okay, so existing regulations in the European Union currently are based on a substance by substance kind of approach, where we have certain PFAS compounds which are restricted or reportable under REACH, persistent organic pollutants, and other regulations. Examples of that are PFOS, PFHXS, PFOA, PFHXA is proposed. We have PFCAs. So we have a lot of these different substances that are being restricted. And when we look at how that's being accomplished, we can see that the REACH SVHC list, the candidate list for authorization, has things like GenX, PFBS, PFHXS, PFHPA on it. We have different REACH substances that are undergoing REACH evaluation, like PFHXA. And then we have yet other compounds that are being slowly classified under the CLP regulation under different hazard classes, which brings them into scopes into different regulations like a medical device regulation, et cetera. But more importantly, the biggest risk right now to manufacturers is a proposed ban on PFAS in the EU. And this would apply to all products, including electronic devices, electrical equipment. And basically, this is a ban that's been proposed by 5 different EU member states. And what this does is it bans all PFAS from use, except for essential uses. Now, the problem is that the proposal doesn't define what these essential uses would be. So that still needs to be worked out between the authorities and the industries. And this applies to all industries, not just electronics, but to us as electronic and electrical equipment manufacturers. This is a potential concern, right? So this proposal was actually put forth in January and published in February of 2023. So the proposal's been out for about a year or so now. There was a 6-month consultation period that ended back in September. During that consultation period, the European Chemicals Agency received more than 5,600 comments from more than 4,400 organizations, companies, and individuals. So what that means is that there's a lot of work to be done. Now, the European Chemicals Agency is required to go through all 5,600 comments and take those seriously and evaluate those. So what the final form of this ban or this requirement is going to be is still yet to be known. But we do know that under its current definition, it covers approximately 10,000 PFAS in scope for the ban based on European Chemicals Agency's inventory of PFAS or known PFAS. They're expected to come into force in some form in 2026, maybe 2027, depending on how quickly the European Chemicals Agency and member states are able to move forward with this. But we know that this is coming towards us and we will have to deal with this in some form. So you can see that the EU requirements right now are mostly just substance by substance using existing regulations we're dealing with today. We are already dealing with PFAS at some level, but we do need to prepare for the EU ban that's coming. Now let's move over to the United States and see what's happening in those markets. Now, the biggest thing that people are talking about in the United States is reporting and record keeping requirements for PFAS under Section 8A7 of the Toxic Substance Control Act. And what this is a requirement to report the use of manufacture and import of PFAS into the United States under Part 705 of Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And this requirement became effective in November 13, 2023. So they published it in October, and a month later, it became basically in force. Now, however, the reporting period doesn't start until November of this year and goes through May of 2025, with that period extended for smaller manufacturers. And what this requirement mandates is that manufacturers and importers of PFAS or importers of PFAS containing articles specifically, and this is what gets the electronics industry in scope, in any year from January 1st, 2011 to November 13th, 2023. So we're talking a 12-year span. They have to report electronically information on which PFAS was present in those imported articles, the production or import volumes, the disposal information, exposure and hazard information. So basically, a great detailed data set needs to be submitted to EPA, covering 12 years of article imports into the US of PFAS present in those articles. Now, making this more of a challenge is that, just like we saw earlier, the scope of PFAS for this requirement is slightly different than any of the other requirements like the EU ban or any other kind of PFAS restrictions that we're seeing out there. It's got a unique structural definition. So just because we know a PFAS is present doesn't necessarily mean that it's reportable under this requirement. So this requires a little bit of chemistry to be applied to ensure that we're reporting correctly. Luckily, EPA has identified 12,697 PFAS that are on their inventory that meet the structural definition, and they provided that in the form of a reference list that they continue to update. So we can reference that list to see, well, which PFAS really meet that structural definition. We don't necessarily have to be a chemist to figure that out. But we do have to keep in mind that if we are aware that a PFAS is present that's not on that list, we need to check and make sure it doesn't meet the structural definition, because even if it's not on the reference list, if it meets the structural definition, it's still in scope to be reported. The information will be submitted to EPA using their central data exchange system, which already exists today, and they are creating a streamlined reporting form that's going to be provided for importers of articles. So importers of articles will face a slightly different mandate than producers of raw PFAS within the United States. So what it basically says, manufacturers who have imported a PFAS within an article must report the required information to the extent they know or can reasonably ascertain. And that's worded right into the regulation. And what this tells us is that EPA is aware that going back to 2011, we may not be able to figure out every single, PFAS chemical that was in every single article that we imported. But to the extent we're able to figure that out, we're supposed to try and provide that to them. And if we have some data, but we don't know all of the information, we can reasonably make reasonable estimates. Basically, so if we have data that's not known or reasonably ascertainable, then go ahead and estimate. For example, maybe I don't know exactly how many of these units I imported in 2011, so I can make some estimates on that. That's also allowed. So as we look at the type of data that we have to submit, just keep in mind that that's just within the context of reasonably ascertainable information. Now, looking a little bit more detail at, well, what information are we going to have to submit under Section 8A7? Well, the information that's relevant in the streamlined reporting form includes things like, your company name and the site information that you're importing or using those articles, and then chemical specific information like the common or the trade name of the PFAS compound in use, the identity, like CAS number, the TSCA accession number, maybe the low volume exemption number, whatever kind of identifier that you have needs to be included. And then the molecular structure of that PFAS, which if you have the CAS number, that's already known. But if you don't, you may have to provide the molecular structure of the PFAS that you've been using. If the chemical identity is unknown, then you can provide a generic name. So whatever you can reasonably ascertain as to the identity needs to be provided. Now, you also need to disclose the physical form of the PFAS. Is it a gas? Is it a liquid? And in most cases, since you're importing articles that already contain PFAS, you would simply select other solid, which is basically the form that's going to be present in, most articles that are imported. So that's pretty much an easy one to choose. Now, getting into categories of use, you need to disclose how the PFAS was used inside the article. So this is not necessarily the use of the article, but the use of the PFAS itself. Was it used as a flame retardant? Was it used as a cleanser? Was it used as a stabilizer or a colorant? That kind of thing. And that's done with a functional category that's picked from a pick list, right? So you have to disclose that information. And then you also need to disclose how the PFAS is being used by you, in which case you would choose code U, right? Which is non-incorporative activities, because you're not incorporating the PFAS chemical into the article yourself, but rather you're importing an article which has already had the PFAS incorporated into it by somebody else before you imported it. So code U is what you would use in that case. So you have the functional category where you're selecting why it's there, and then you're actually letting EPA know that you didn't actually put that in there, but your supplier did before you imported it. There's other information that we have to provide on the use of this PFAS. The sector code, which is going to be the sector of the industry that your product is used in. For example, if you make a laptop computer, you would choose code IS41, which is computer and electronic product manufacturing. That's where you're using that article. Additionally, you need to provide the consumer and commercial use information. So how is the end product going to be used? In this case, if it was a laptop computer, I would choose the example shown here, CC220, other machinery, mechanical appliances, and electronic and electrical articles, right? So we're disclosing, basically the sector and the industry that the end use of this PFAS is being involved in. And we also need to disclose whether it's used for consumer or commercial use, or both, and if it's used by children. When we're providing this information, we need to disclose the estimated maximum concentration of the PFAS in the product or in the article, and as well as the imported volume. And when they talk about imported volume for article importers, we're talking about the quantity of articles in units that are imported or the tonnage of units, not necessarily the quantity of the PFAS itself. And if we have any additional information, they're asking us to apply that, you provide that information as well. For example, the PFAS is encapsulated in a polymer, so therefore it has no kind of risk, that kind of thing. You can optionally provide that kind of detail if you'd like. Now, once you provide this information to EPA, you have to keep that for a period of 5 years because they may come back to you and want to review that information with you. And remember, this is a one-time submission requirement. You don't have to repeat this. So once you've made your reporting and submitted through the CDX in the reporting window, you've met the requirement permanently. This is a fact-finding mission on the behalf of EPA to determine where PFAS is being used in the United States, which PFAS is being used, so that they can move forward with legislation in the future. This is not going to be an ongoing requirement. So when we look at that 8A7 reporting requirements, that really is the only federal level PFAS requirements, the only national level requirement that manufacturers of electronics are facing when it comes to PFAS. And it's largely only applicable to US companies, because it has to do with companies that are importing or producing PFAS or PFAS containing articles within the United States. However, if you're a foreign producer, your customers in the United States may be needing that kind of information from you in order to meet their reporting requirements. Now, moving on to state level PFAS actions, we can see that there's a lot more going on at the state level. There's at least 23 states that have enacted drinking water standards in the last handful of months. Now, we dodged a bullet in California where the governor of California recently vetoed a bill that would have required all products that contain PFAS to be registered with the state government effective in January 1st, 2026. Look, that would have affected electronic equipment, but luckily the governor vetoed that and we dodged that bullet. And instead of approving that bill, he approved 2 other bills which ban PFAS in cosmetics and clothing. So rather than apply it to all products, California narrowed the scope and only applied it to cosmetics and clothing, which allowed us to, avoid that requirement. However, we are not out of risk in California for requirements because there is Proposition 65. And much like the European Union, Proposition 65 is addressing PFAS on a chemical by chemical basis. They've already added several PFAS compounds to the Proposition 65 list, and they are considering adding more. And what happens is that if anybody in California is at risk of exposure to any of these chemicals at unsafe levels, then a warning must be provided with the product so that they're warned of the potential risk of exposure. So this is a unique kind of requirement because companies face very large enforcement actions in the millions of dollars in settlements when they face these kind of enforcement actions on this. So this is something that industry needs to watch very closely. Looking at other states, we can see that the requirements that are coming out of most of the other states do not involve electronic equipment. So we see like Colorado has enacted a requirement which implements PFAS disclosure requirements, but only in things like carpets, food contact products, children's products, cosmetics, furniture. Again, avoiding electronic equipment as one of the target industries for their regulation. But then when we look at things like Maine and Minnesota, we can see they've implemented some PFAS reporting requirements for all products that are sold in their states, and that does include electronic equipment. So this is where the state level requirements are really driving the needs of the electronics industry to collect information from their supply chain and meet PFAS reporting mandates and upcoming restrictions. So let's take a look then at, for example, Maine's requirement and see what exactly we need to do here. Now, in July of 2021, the state of Maine published an act basically to address the PFAS issue. And what it does is it implements new PFAS reporting and restrictions under Title 38, Section 1614 of the Maine State Code. And under that requirement, effective January 1st of next year, producers must notify the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, or DEP, of any product containing intentionally added PFAS that's sold in the state of Maine. And because companies can't really control when they're importing product into the United States or selling product in the United States, the logistics on a state-by-state basis, this becomes, applicable to just about anybody who sells products in the United States by default. Now, these reports that need to be submitted at a minimum require a brief description of the product you're selling, and the purpose of the PFAS is in the product. Right? You know, I'm using this PFAS as a flame retardant in this television set, for example. Now, the amount of the PFAS needs to be disclosed as well as the identity, the CAS number. You know, if there's no CAS number, then identify it the best way you can. And then you have to provide your contact information so that the Maine Department of Environmental Protection can follow up with you if they need to. Now, some interesting things about this is that packaging is not in scope unless the product itself is packaging. So if you sell a laptop computer in Maine, the laptop computer has PFAS, you need to report that. If the packaging does have PFAS, you don't have to report that. Also, companies that are very small, less than 25 employees, are exempt from this reporting requirement. Now, in order to make this this notification to DEP, you need to submit that to an online database, and DEP is currently working with IC2 to develop such a reporting system. But the system is currently not yet in place, which means there is no system to make the submission yet. However, regardless of whether the system is available to make the submission or not, your obligation to notify is still there. So what that means is that if you need to make a submission and they have not yet made the portal available, then you need to make your submission through email using this email address I've shown you here. And you could submit that using any commonly available software format, so PDF, Microsoft Word, etc. Now, if you cannot meet that January 1st deadline for whatever reason, you can submit a letter requesting an extension. Just write up a letter that explains the challenges you're facing in meeting the January 1st requirement dates, and then send that to that same email, pfasproducts@maine.gov, and then ideally the DEP will get back to you and provide you with an extension to give you more time so that you can collect the data from the supply chain you need. It is also possible that a industry association could make such a request for an extension on behalf of all of its members. As long as you are listed as a company in that request, you could be covered by a group exemption as well. Right? Now, in addition to the reporting requirements where you have to load information on the presence of PFAS into this database, as of January 1st, 2023, PFAS has been prohibited in certain products. Lucky for us, just carpets, rugs, and fabric treatments. But in January 1st, 2030, the sale of all products containing PFAS will be prohibited unless the DEP has deemed the use unavoidable. So what we have is a situation where effective in 2025, we have a reporting requirement. But 5 years later in 2030, that turns into an EU style ban, right? Where we can no longer sell those products after 2030 unless we've convinced the DEP that the use of the PFAS in that product is unavoidable. So when we move over now to Minnesota, which is the other state that has this kind of reporting and restriction, we can see that they've implemented a similar kind of requirement as Maine. They've done it in a different way, though. They added it to their Maine appropriations bill in 2023. Instead of creating a specific law saying, hey, we're going to restrict PFAS, they simply added as a line to their state budget. So this was signed by the governor in May of 2023 and requires reporting of PFAS in products sold in Minnesota effective January 1st, 2026. Notice that's 1 year later than the Maine requirement. So Maine comes into effect in January of 2025. Minnesota hits us in 2026, giving us an extra year to prepare. Now, because this was put into a financial bill, the final actual implementing rule will be published by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, or MPCA. That's not there yet, but the actual details are actually in the legislative document. The requirements are very similar, but not identical to Maine. There are some differences, some small differences, so we'll talk about those. And what this law allows the MPCA commissioner to do is enter into a data sharing agreement with another state. So will they combine with Maine so we can make one submission to cover both Maine and Minnesota? There's a strong chance that will happen, but we don't know for sure. Now, I've referenced here the Minnesota session law where this was enacted. It was enacted under the state session where they approved their budget for the year. And what it mandates is in January 1st, 2026, producers must notify Minnesota Pollution Control Agency of any product containing intentionally added PFAS sold in Minnesota. When we look at the requirements, there are requirements for the type of data submitted are identical to Maine's. The brief description of the product, the purpose of the PFAS in the product, the amount, the identification, and then the contact information of the person at the manufacturer who can be followed up with by the authorities if needed. So this is exactly the same as Maine, which is why it looks very strong that hopefully they'll enter into a data sharing agreement and allow us to make one submission for both. However, there are some differences between Maine and Minnesota. For example, in the current legislation, there's no packaging exemption or small company exemption listed. Will the final implementing regulation mirror Maine and apply those? We don't know for sure, but under the current legislation published in the current state legislature, it's not. Those are not there, right? Now, there is a clause in this that allows for a Maine style extension. So you can actually request an extension for this requirement if you can't meet the 2026 reporting deadline. Another difference between Minnesota and Maine is that Minnesota can mandate that you provide test data. If they think you're selling a product in Minnesota and you haven't made a notification to them, they can mandate that you provide them test data to prove that there's no PFAS present. That's different from Maine, which can only require that you provide a certificate of PFAS absence. So Minnesota can mandate testing, Maine cannot under their laws. When we look at the PFAS restrictions, we can see the same kind of restrictions that we saw with Maine are coming to effect in Minnesota, where in January of 2032, basically all products prohibit the use of PFAS unless the use can be deemed unavoidable by MCPA. That means that between now and 2030 for Maine, or between now and 2032 for Minnesota, if you have PFAS present in your products and you're reporting that to the database for them, you need to work with those state agencies if you want to continue to sell your product with PFAS after 2030 or 2032 for Maine or Minnesota. Now, there are restrictions that are hitting in 2025, but again, it doesn't affect electronic equipment, although it does affect more products than are currently, prohibited from having PFAS under Maine. We can see things like cookware, dental floss, juvenile products, ski wax, upholstered furniture. So we see a lot more products coming into scope for the prohibitions that are hitting in 2025 than the prohibitions in Maine that hit in 2023, but neither one of them include electronic equipment. So really, it's the 2032 date we're concerned about for Minnesota and the 2030 date we're concerned about for Maine. All right, so I know that's a lot to digest. We went through information on, what a PFAS is, the challenges involved with finding PFAS in our network because of varying definitions and requirements. We looked at all the detailed information that we're required to provide according to the U.S. requirements in TSCA, Section 8A7, Maine, Minnesota. And we can see that the actual Maine reporting requirements, we need to be working on those now because it's mandatory to sell our products after the upcoming January 1st, which is only, 8 months away? We are going to have to do this work. So we need to be working on collecting information from our supply chain to meet these requirements. So now the question is, how are we going to do that? Well, GreenSoft has a solution, and I'm going to go over that solution with you. Now, what GreenSoft is offering is a presence of PFAS collection program. And what this is it's a generic, broad-based collection of PFAS presence in parts and materials that you use to make your products. And the intention is to collect information from the supply chain on the presence of PFAS in parts and materials so that we can cover any new or emerging PFAS restrictions or reporting requirements. And that includes what I've showed you today. It includes Maine, Minnesota, right? We're facing those kind of things right now. Section 8A7, the reporting period starts in November, right? The proposed PFAS ban in the EU, we need to prepare for that. So we need to start collecting data now for that. And then there are other PFAS lists like IEC 62474, which is the electronics industry reference list, OECD's, the EPA's master inventory. These are all PFAS lists that could be referenced in any future PFAS requirements coming at us, whether they're European, they're coming from the US, or maybe even from Asia or other areas in the world. So what GreenSoft will do is GreenSoft will go into the supply chain and contact suppliers and collect PFAS information, basically collect information on the presence of PFAS from the suppliers if they have it available. And if they don't have it available, put it on notice that that information is needed so they can start working on getting that information. And when we do this, we're going to do this in a generic way. We're going to use the most generic definition out there, which is the one referenced by Maine and Minnesota, which is substances that include any member of the class of fluorinated organic chemicals containing at least one fluorinated carbon atom. So any of the other more narrow structural definitions would automatically be captured by this collection. When we do this collection, we're going to reference the EPA master list. So the inventory of EPA, which has over 15,000, and the OECD list, which has over 4,700. And when you combine those together, you have basically a huge list of PFAS that they can reference. So if they're not quite sure what a PFAS is, they can simply reference those reference lists. However, we will make it clear to them that they're aware of a PFAS being present. It needs to be reported even if it's not on those reference lists. So we're capturing that kind of far-reaching requirement there. When the PFAS compliance information is not available from the suppliers, we'll ask them to provide a full material disclosure. What that is an accounting of every material present in the part, as well as every substance present in each one of those materials. When we have that inventory of substances present, then we can determine if any of those substances are actually PFAS or not. And we'll also collect that even if they do provide the PFAS declaration, and we'll use it as a validation tool to make sure that what they're reporting on their PFAS declaration matches what they're providing on the full material disclosure they've provided, right? So we're going to utilize our collection experience and our expertise in full material disclosure and bring that to bear to identify and disclose PFAS present in parts and materials. Now, we saw before that the Section 8A7 requirements have a great deal of other information that we need to provide besides just, hey, PFAS is present, right? So if they indicate that PFAS is present, then we will also ask them to indicate if that particular PFAS is subject to reporting under 8A7, right? And to do that, they're going to have to confirm that that particular PFAS is in scope for the specific structural definition called out under 8A7 that I've listed here. We're also going to ask them to provide this information on parts and materials that they've provided going all the way back to 2011. So this covers the additional historical requirements, as well as making sure that we're identifying which PFAS are subject to this reporting and which ones are present but are not subject to this reporting. Now, when we do that, we are going to provide them with the reference list that's published by EPA. So if they're not chemistry experts, they can reference that list, which currently has almost 13,000 substances on it, to see, hey, is this PFAS on that list? Is it subject to this reporting or not? Now, they will be told, though, that if it does meet the structural definition, but it's not on EPA's reference list, you still need to let us know so that we can report that. The supplier will be asked to provide that functional category. So they'll be asked to pick it from the list provided by EPA of functional category codes and provide the substance identity, whether that's a CAS number, TSCA accession number, or a low volume exemption number, as well as the concentration, the location, and the item, et cetera. So all of those details needed for Section 8A7 reporting will be collected as part of this collection service. Now, when we look at the if we look at the form used to collect this data, you can see that it provides a great deal of detailed instructions on how to provide the information. So we're asking questions on, is it present, yes or no? If it is, then is it subject to EPA? If you have any questions about what that means, all of the reference lists are linked into the collection form, as well as the structural definitions are provided here. So it makes it as easy as possible for the supplier to answer those questions. Now, we also provide, as part of the survey form, the actual functional category list under Section 8A7, so they can simply look at how this substance is being used and give us the functional category code right up front. And then finally, all the data elements that we need to support Section 8A7, Maine reporting requirements, Minnesota reporting requirements, the EU prohibitions, and any of the individual substance restrictions under REACH, persistent organic pollutants, Prop 65, all that information is here. right? So we're collecting all the different parameters needed in order to meet all of the reporting requirements that are available today, as well as any that could come at us in the future. So this collection service is really kind of a way to kind of just cast the big net and get the data you need to meet all of your PFAS reporting and requirements and restrictions, both current and in the future. And this is all done using our proven data collection process. GreenSoft's been around a long time, over 20 years. We've been collecting data on environmental compliance and substance content for over 2 decades for the electronics industry. And we have a solution that's made up of extensive hands-on data collection, data checks, and validations. We have an extensive group of databases that we use, part and supplier databases, that we leverage to streamline this data collection process and leverage to validate the data and make sure it's accurate and correct. During the collection projects, you get a dedicated project manager who's going to work with you and meet with you several times a month, and they're going to guide you, give you advice. You'll have access to our subject matter experts. And so you're able to make sure that this isn't just something where it's just a portal, but you actually have a dedicated team on your side that's collecting this data for you. And we also offer a Green Data Manager, which is software that allows you to do detailed analysis and reporting on your products, generate reports on PFAS, as well as other regulations like EU RoHS, EU REACH, Prop 65, persistent organic pollutants, etc. So all you really need to do is give us the parts list, all the items that you're using to build your products, and then we'll go ahead and we'll collect the information on those, right? If you have data you've already collected, you can give us that as well, and we'll go ahead and validate that information, follow up with the suppliers if some of it's incorrect or incomplete, and roll that into the data set as well. Now, the benefits of using this service is that you get hands-on data collection. This is not a portal where we ask the suppliers to log in and fill out a bunch of information, but rather we contact them via email, through telephone, and our engineers work with them directly to get this information because, as you saw, this information is very complex and they may need assistance. If they need assistance, we have a supplier support team that will contact them directly through the phone and help guide them through the process. So that's how we can ensure a very high completion rate, and we can ensure high quality data because this is going through our quality assurance and data validation processes as well. And we're able to leverage our existing supplier relationships. We have relationships with over 59,000 suppliers. And we have pre-existing communication channels. We're already talking to the supply chain, collecting data for many companies on RoHS, on REACH, Prop 65, things of that nature. So they're very accustomed to dealing with us, okay? Now, when you look at these databases I'm talking about, GreenSoft has built a components database, which is a database of components that we've collected data on in the past, as well as a supplier database, so we know exactly who to contact for what information at the different suppliers. We have a materials database, so if you're building products out of alloys or polymers, don't necessarily have a off-the-shelf component, that's okay. Our engineers can use the specifications from our materials database to do the analysis ourselves. And we also have a replacement parts database. So if you find an individual item does contain PFAS and you want to replace it with one that does not, then you can go ahead and use our replacement parts database to find suggestions for alternate parts. So a lot of information that we can leverage here because, as I said, we have 20 years of experience and we've been building up these databases over 20 years' time, okay? So when you look at our component database as an example, that has over 95 million part numbers in it from 59,000 manufactured worldwide. Of those, almost 12 million parts have full material disclosure information that we can use to evaluate that for PFAS content. So we have a lot of existing information already in our database. If we don't have it in our database, no problem. We're going to go to the supplier and get it. But there's a good chance that a lot of the off-the-shelf parts we already are able to resolve on day one of the project, right? So the data collection and validation process is very robust. So as I mentioned, we contact suppliers directly through email and phone. We do it as many times as it takes to obtain the data. We may have to go back and forth with them to help them understand the errors or the gaps so they can fill those. There is no portal for them to deal with. They don't have to log into a website and create an account. They don't have to be experts in this. We can be the experts for them and guide them through the process. And we use ASQ Z1.4 sampling to ensure data quality of 99.9%. So this data that we're providing is validated and highly accurate. And whenever we identify gaps or we identify problems with the data, we go back to the supplier and address that before we deliver that to you. So you don't have to worry that you're reporting bad information to EPA or that you're over reporting things that aren't there to Maine, et cetera. You're having that validation and data scrubbing done before you ever receive the data from us. Okay. And then finally, our Green Data Manager software allows you to take the information that's been collected and analyze that information at the product level or at the supply chain level. You can identify which parts and materials within your supply chain are using which PFAS compounds and which specific requirements, regulations, or PFAS lists those are violating. So you can identify your risks and start addressing those in your supply chain. Or as in the case of this slide here, you can actually load your product bill of material into the software and do product level reporting and determine just exactly what PFAS is present in your product, how much is present, and where it's present in the product, enabling you to meet your Maine reporting requirements, Minnesota, TSCA 887, whatever it is. Or when the EU ban comes up, you're able to do your risk analysis before that takes effect and take action to make sure that you don't have any market access denial issues in the EU as a result of the upcoming EU PFAS ban. Okay, it's very powerful software. And in addition to PFAS, the software has built-in regulations that cover things like EU ROS, UK ROS, EU REACH, Annex 14, Annex 17, SVHC, Proposition 65, persistent organic pollutants, ozone depleting substances, halogen-free, low halogen. The list goes on and on and on, right? All built into the software. So it's more than just a PFAS tool, but it is a very powerful PFAS tool if you use what you're using it for. Okay. All right. So that pretty much summarizes what our solution is. So we've talked about what PFAS is, the challenges we're facing because of the varying definitions and approaches that regulatory agencies are using to address the PFAS problem. We talked about what's going on currently with PFAS in the EU, what we're facing in the future in the EU, as well as what's going on in the United States, both at the federal and state level. And we've talked about the GreenSoft solution and how we can meet all those requirements both now and in the future. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions and see if we can get some of your questions answered while we still have some time.
All right, thanks, Randy. We have a ton of questions already, so I'm going to jump right in. Is PTFE classified as PFAS? In what use will PTFA be regulated?
PTFE is in fact a PFAS. It is considered a PFAS, and it's actually the compound that's most commonly used in, say, firefighting foams and fire protection equipment. And so that's something that needs to be addressed because that's one of the ones that's being targeted. Now, PTFA, as far as how that's going to be addressed, it's hard to say. We see the general PFAS bans, which will cover all PFAS compounds. So the EU ban, I believe both of those substances would be subject to the TSCA 887 reporting. Those substances would be subject to reporting under Maine and Minnesota. And the substances would definitely be, restricted from Maine, Minnesota, and EU unless you can get the relevant authorities to identify their specific use in your product as an essential use.
Okay. We are an end user and we buy a part from a distributor. Is my company or my customer obligated to inquire about PFAS status as we are not a direct importer per the EPA?
Per EPA TSCA Section 887, it applies to people who have imported articles. So if you're not the importer, then you wouldn't be subject to the TSCA reporting. Your importer would. So if you're buying from a distributor, then that distributor, if they're importing directly, then they would be the one subject to that reporting. And if they're buying from an importer, which is likely, then it would be that importer that would be subject to the reporting themselves. So it's whoever imports the item. So as a downstream user, you would be out of scope for the TSCA 887 reporting.
Okay. Do we already know when the European Chemicals Agency will provide feedback on the comments from the public consultation?
We don't, unfortunately. Ideally, they would come back relatively quickly, like maybe in a 6-month time frame. So we would be expecting it now. But considering the fact that they had 5,600 comments, it's going to take them some time. They don't have an unlimited staff there, and so they have to they have to do their due diligence. So I would expect, based on a number of comments, that it will take some time. We may not even see anything come out this year, although it might be the end of the year. So we can only kind of take a guess. They haven't provided any feedback into when they're going to be able to give us a response to the comment period. We're hoping to get more information out of them this year, but it may run into 2025 before we see any updates from them on that.
Okay. How many PFAS slash PFOS compounds are identified in the PFAS family?
Well, basically all the PFOS compounds are technically in scope. Now, there are some PFOS related compounds that may not be identified as PFAS. And again, that depends on what definition you're operating under. So anything with a fluorinated carbon atom, if you're using that definition, then basically all PFOS would be in scope. You know, if you start looking at the structural definition under, EPA, then you would have to look at the individual compounds to see. Now, it's hard to say because when you're talking about a PFOS and its salts kind of thing, you're talking about, man-made chemicals. So you say, well, there's this many known chemicals that, meet the structural definition, but that's really hard to say because you may not know all the chemicals out there. But I would say you should just consider all PFOS to be in scope for PFAS restrictions.
Okay. If we do not import, but we use a PFAS product that is made in the US, do we need to report?
No, you do not. Not under TSCA Section 8A7. It applies to the manufacture of raw PFAS. It applies to the import of raw PFAS, and it applies to the import of articles which contain PFAS. So the idea being is they want to know what PFAS is being produced and used in the United States. So once it's reported by the producer, then it doesn't need to be re-reported by the user. So that's the context anyway. So if you're using a product that already contains PFAS in it that you did not produce or import, then you have no obligation to report under Section 8A7.
Okay. Are the date ranges for Maine similar to the EPA TSCA, or are they only requesting data for the current year?
Maine and Minnesota is only requesting that you provide data on information and data on products that you're placing on the market. So in other words, if you want to put your product on the market and sell it in Maine and it contains PFAS, you need to make a notification. There is no historical data requirements for the Maine or Minnesota requirements.
Would labeling be included in PFAS reporting in the US if labeling is not the end product bought by the consumer?
If you are importing labels from outside the United States and those labels contain PFAS, then you would be subject to the TSCA Section 8A7 requirement because you're importing articles that contain PFAS. However, if you are using those labels on packaging, they would be exempt from reporting under Maine. If you have a label on your product that contains PFAS, then it would be reportable under Maine and Minnesota both. So again, the scope kind of varies depending on the application of the label, but the label is an article, so it would be subject to TSCA reporting if it is imported on its own or on a product. And it would definitely be reportable under Minnesota, and it would be reportable under Maine if it's incorporated into a product. But if it was if it was on packaging, it would be considered packaging and exempt under Maine.
The main requirement talks about intentionally adding PFAS. Since our supplier adds the PFAS into the component prior to us importing our product into Maine, can we make the argument that we are not intentionally adding PFAS and get our products exempted?
No, the idea of intentionally added is compared to naturally occurring, basically. So if that PFAS was intentionally added to your product anywhere in the supply chain, then it becomes reportable under Maine and Minnesota. When they say intentionally added, what they're meaning is that if you have some kind of naturally occurring levels of PFAS compounds that are present or some trace elements that are unintentionally incorporated as a result of maybe a manufacturing process, then those would not need to be disclosed. But if you're intentionally adding PFAS at any stage in the manufacturing process, even if it's by your suppliers, for some kind of purpose like flame retardancy or anti-corrosion or polymer stabilization or colorants, then you would definitely need to disclose that you would be in scope.
Okay. If you don't have PFAS in your products, do you have to send any documents stating that for any of the upcoming reporting requirements in Maine, Minnesota, or to the EPA?
No, you do not. You do not have to make a report to the EPA if you've imported articles that contain no PFAS. You only have to make the report if you do. The same is true with Maine and Minnesota. If you are selling a product with PFAS and you're required to make a submission to the database, there is no concept of making a negative submission saying I'm selling my product and it contains no PFAS. You would be exempt from the requirements altogether if you don't have PFAS present.
What is our option if suppliers don't have PFAS information and cannot provide FMD information?
Well, that's a big challenge. So this is where we have to push on the supply chain, right? Because under TSCA, we saw that it's to the end, we have to report information that's reasonably ascertainable. So if we can show we did our due diligence and try to collect that information and it's not available in the supply chain, then that's good enough to meet the TSCA requirements. But when it comes to Maine and Minnesota, there's an expectation that we know that we're placing products on the market that contain PFAS. So if our suppliers aren't able to provide that, then we need to push on them to do so or find new suppliers. If they if they're unable to do so, we could do things like perform some engineering analysis or risk analysis. For example, I can look at a material and determine whether I think that fluorinated compounds would have been added to that based on currently available engineering or industry data. I could go ahead and I could have testing performed if I needed to do so, but there is no kind of exemption at the legislative level that says, well, if your suppliers don't know if it's there, you're off the hook. So we do have to put our due diligence in and doing everything we can to determine where the PFAS is present. And suppliers who can't, provide that information need to be put on notice because these requirements aren't going anywhere, right? You can't just put your head in the sand and say, well, I don't know, so therefore I'm not going to be able to disclose, because those kind of suppliers are going to go away. They're not going to be able to be used in the supply chain and they're going to be phased out. So suppliers that don't have this information need to start working on getting it. And the more pressure we can put on them now to start working on that, the less of a problem that's going to be as these requirements start piling up on us.
All right, I'm going to combine these two questions. Is there a threshold for reporting? And another similar question, what concentration ranges do we have to report in the US?
There is no specific threshold for reporting. If it's intentionally added that you need to disclose it's there. Now the ranges I haven't, they still working on the database in the state level, so I'm not sure. Now there are ranges defined in the TSCA legislation as far as, the percentage present. I don't know what those ranges are off the top of my head, but you can follow you can take a look at the Code of Federal Regulations reference that I put in here, and it's in the legislation as far as what the range reporting is.
Okay, I have a bunch of questions here about scope. So we have some people asking if industrial products are covered, if medical products are covered, batteries, and packaging.
Okay, well, it's kind of a wide net to cast there because every regulation scope is a little differently. But looking at TSCA requirements, we have to keep in mind that TSCA has an exemption for medical devices, that if something is controlled by FDA, then it's not subject to TSCA reporting. So that is something that we need to be aware of there. So medical devices would probably, as long as they're regulated by FDA, they exempt from the TSCA requirements. However, there is no such medical device exemption in Maine or Minnesota. There would be no such exemption, I don't think, for the EU ban, but that could be something that comes out of those comment periods. So we don't know, right? So the answer is kind of for medical devices is kind of depends in the US on what kind of medical device it is, or if it's regulated by FDA or not. But for TSCA, but would be in scope for Maine and Minnesota. Industrial equipment, yes, in scope. Absolutely. And what were the other categories?
Industrial, medical, car batteries, and packaging.
Car batteries and packaging. So we've already identified that packaging is out of scope for the main requirement, but in scope for Minnesota. It would be in scope for TSCA 887 if the packaging is imported as articles into the US. As far as the European requirements go, again, the EU ban is going to be, the scope is unknown at this time, but as it's written, those things would be in scope. As far as, the individual substances restricted in the EU today, the scope applies based on the regulation. For example, we know what products are exempt or not exempt from REACH or from persistent organic pollutants, which is on a substance by substance basis on persistent organic pollutants on what's exempt and what's not. So we'd have to refer to those regulations to figure out if the individual item is exempt or not from the requirements. But overall, there is no kind of sweeping exemptions for these kind of things for, car batteries, things like that I've seen, related to, if I'm going to sell a car battery in Maine or Minnesota, there's nothing in the legislation that says car batteries are exempt.
Okay. We are at the top of the hour, but let's just do two more questions. And then if anyone has any remaining questions, you can just email us and we'll try to get back to you via email. So, second to last question, gathering data since 2011 is challenging. How are we supposed to address this? Any recommendations?
Yeah, that is challenging. The first step would be to go back into your logistical records and see what you have as far as records of what you've imported. Now, keep in mind that this is for imported articles, so it's the items that you've imported, not items you've less necessarily purchased from distributors. That makes it an even bigger challenge, right? Because hey, 10 years ago when I was building my products, I was sourcing components from who knows where, right? Was I importing those directly from China? Was I buying those from a distributor in the US? It's really hard to say. So go back. This first step would be go back through the logistical records and see what you have as far as what you purchased and from whom. That would be the first step. Next step is then to contact those suppliers and see what information they can provide. Now, EPA has acknowledged that it's a tall order to go back to 2011 and try to get this information, which is why they put right into the legislation that the expectation is you provide whatever is reasonably ascertainable. They don't expect you to be able to provide 100% data going all the way back to 2011. But if you're able to find that information out, hey, I did import these particular items. We know they had PFAS. This is the amounts. Then they want you to let them know, right? So it is a challenge, and that's why we recommend starting to pull your supply chain now. Try to figure out what information they have available. Put them on notice so they can start doing their tracing. They can start going back through their supply chain, figuring out the materials they used. They may not be able to give you back to 2011, but maybe they can give you back to 2019. Whatever they can get you back to, that's what you need to get, right? So the idea is that you're performing as much due diligence as you can. Can I make some kind of, there's no silver bullet to this, unfortunately. I can't really make a recommendation of, hey, just, go ahead and follow A, B, and C and you're done. No, it's going to be different for everybody. Everybody has a different supply chain. Everybody has different products. But the key is try to identify what data you think you can get and go after that data.
Excellent. Okay, last question. In terms of the PFAS lists for all these regulations, are Minnesota and Maine using their own lists, or are they using the EPA 8A7 list?
Well, because the requirements themselves don't point to a specific list, they just have a structural definition. Maine and Minnesota are using the most generic definition, which is basically any fluorinated carbon atom constitutes PFAS. So they do reference the EPA's master inventory. They do reference that. They say, hey, you can look here, but they do also say that, hey, that is not all inclusive. That if you have a PFAS present that's not on an EPA reference list, you still need to report that to us. EPA even says that, hey, we may not be aware of every PFAS in the world. So if you have something meets the definition of this requirement, you need to report it even if it's not on the list. So those lists really are only provided as reference lists. So while Maine and Minnesota do reference the EPA's master inventory, right? They, really, ideally what you should be doing is kind of looking at all sources and creating your own superset, if you will, of all known PFAS, or if you can figure out which PFAS are likely to be present in your products, you could focus on those. Like if I was making firefighting protection equipment, then I would obviously be seeking out PTFE because that's typically what's used. I would identify the compounds at high risk and go after those first, and then say, by the way, do you have any of these others, right? So that I can quantify those risks. So the answer to that question is that they are referencing the EPA's master inventory, but don't consider that an all-inclusive list to them because they don't.
Okay, great. That's all the time we have. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your morning or afternoon with us. Thank you, Randy. Just a reminder to everyone, check your email inbox today or tomorrow. We will be sending a PDF copy of these slides and a recording of this webinar. If you have any remaining questions, you can email us and we'll try to get back to you via email. And we are hosting another webinar next month on compliance strategies for electronic manufacturers using full material declaration data. So visit us at greensofttech.com to register for that webinar. And also, we have a webinar archive online at greensofttech.com where you can see recordings of all our previous webinars. We cover regulations such as EU REACH, UK ROS, the SCIP database, and much more. We also have other resources such as the EU ROS exemptions list, some white papers you can download. So check us out, greensofttech.com. And once again, thank you for joining us, and hopefully we will see you next time.